You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 421, recorded on Sunday, April 10th, 2022. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line, as always, from Boise, Idaho, is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
So this episode picks up where we left off last week at the end of the 1880s in our narrative on U.S. electrification. So we're going to be assuming that you've listened to that last episode on the sort of development of electricity and electrification from electrochemistry with batteries and so forth into electromagnetism and induction motors and all that kind of stuff. So again, we're expecting that you have that baseline understanding as we continue our narrative here. So the story of electrification of American cities from this point, meaning the late 1880s, forward, is inextricably tied up in the story of streetcar railways, which will be the main focus of today's episode now that we've gotten most of the technical aspects covered last week. But first, before we explain why those stories are so closely linked, we need to cover one more technology point briefly, which is the current wars of the 1880s and early 1890s, something that most people have probably at least vaguely heard about because of the battles between Edison promoting direct current power and Westinghouse promoting alternating current power, and aligned with Nikola Tesla, one of the pioneers of alternating current induction motors, as we discussed last week. Now, of course, we talked about on the last episode what the difference is between direct current and alternating current, and we talked about the various technologies, but at this point in the late 1880s is where we're going to pick back up on the story. So direct current running in one direction was weaker but efficient, which made it ideal for small applications like home light bulbs, but it couldn't really deliver the kind of power loads or distribution distances that larger applications would require. The copper wire needed was much greater for DC for even the same short distances, and copper prices were beginning to rise as the incipient explosive demand for copper wiring began to reach the mining industry. DC was, however, much less likely than early AC technology to cause dangerous situations in the home if people overloaded their circuits and so on. Alternating current, which shifts back and forth directionally, could be used for powering big things, but also, if properly stepped down with power transformers, smaller things as well. And it could provide strong power over longer distances, even if the wasted leakage losses along the way were, and remain to present day, quite high. Westinghouse acquired various AC power-related patents and technologies from Germany and so on, and opened Westinghouse Electric in 1886. We, of course, talked on a recent episode about Westinghouse Air Brakes, which was his original big venture. By 1888, Tesla's technologies were ready, and Westinghouse, who had already opened 68 AC power plants to Edison's 121 DC power plants, continued deploying AC generators and wires, which at this point triggered the current war. Edison and Westinghouse then battled it out in the public eye for a few years, mostly in New York State, with Edison arguing AC infrastructure was much more dangerous than DC, and using all kinds of theatrics around executions of animals and human prisoners with AC Westinghouse equipment. But again, the limitations of DC technology at the time, especially for distance, simply ensured AC's victory anyway, especially as AC safety technology improved, both indoors and in the maze of initially poorly insulated outdoor distribution wiring. Ultimately, Edison conceded defeat, and by 1890 was already stepping back from day-to-day leadership to work on other things unrelated to power generation. His company began converting their power operations from DC to AC, notably via the 1892 merger of Edison Electric and the AC-powered Thomson-Houston Electric Company into the General Electric Company, GE. It's worth noting that J.P. Morgan and other financiers behind the merger actually ended up pushing the Edison team out almost entirely in favor of making Thomas Houston the dominant half of the merger. Edison personally opposed the merger, but was no longer in control anyway. There was some further consolidation to get down to a basic duopoly of GE and Westinghouse, with patent sharing arrangements also pushed through by Morgan. Some DC power plants actually continued operation through the 20th century in the US, but generally the standard was AC power after this point. There were several transitional technologies developed specifically to allow existing DC-based things to operate on the new AC grids until they could be replaced. GE also quickly brought in AC experts to catch up on AC technology. GE and Westinghouse Electric soon had a joint contract for the Niagara Falls hydroelectric project of 1893 to 1895. AC power from such sources was serving the grid dozens of miles away. So, Rachel, I wanted to pause here for a moment to ask if you had any thoughts or observations about the current wars before we sort of move into the big AC electrification era of American cities.
Well, I had heard about the current wars just basically like through what was it like the epic rap battles of history or like drunk history. So it's kind of interesting to get a more like sober take on the current wars. Also, I guess I didn't realize that Edison basically got forced out of leadership of his own company pretty quickly, it seems like. I hadn't heard about that aspect of things, but as we talked about last week, the AC ability to travel longer distances with less leakage than DC power just really gave it the advantage, especially in such a quickly electrifying world and in such a huge country as the United States. That ability to travel long distances just really was the tipping point, it seems like, for the current wars.
I also thought it was interesting the kind of passing mention that I saw on the Wikipedia War of the Currents, which alluded to the copper wire price issues and the quantities involved. I had kind of mentioned that in passing last week as well, but didn't really get into it. I think that's an important thing that I want to emphasize here. Like, we are going to be talking very heavily about American cities today and really not focusing on anything else other than American cities. We're going to come back to talk in a future episode about rural electrification because that's a separate thing, basically. But a lot of the stuff that we're talking about now is happening at the same time as the more rural things are happening that we've talked about on other previous episodes. When we talk about the various struggles in the mining communities and the unionization and IWW pushes and things like that. Some of that's a little bit later in the first decade of the 20th century. But a lot of that is driven by things like the need for additional copper mining and copper production in the Mountain West in the United States. So, it's not the exact time period necessarily, but we're starting to see the seeds being planted of, we're about to need a whole bunch of copper wire. You already start to see the price begin ticking upward during this period. And I just want to, again, underscore that some of the stuff that we've talked about on previous episodes of the show that's happening in a totally different part of the country, nowhere near the major cities, is important for these urban narratives that we're talking about as well. So on the last episode, we talked about early power production without electricity grids using things like horse labor or regular steam engines, and then we talked about the transition to hydropower and very fast spinning steam turbines. We also talked about the early spread of electric streetlights and residential, commercial, or industrial interior lighting. But there was still one significant logistical and financial barrier to implementing the technology across wider interconnected areas in American cities. And that finally brings us to the star of today's episode, electrification by streetcar for load factor balancing. So Rachel will now explain what all of that means and why it matters.
Yeah, so one of the biggest problems facing the early power companies was the hourly variable demand. So as we mentioned last week, lighting was practically the only use of electricity in the early days. And so demand was high during the first hours of the before the workday and the evening hours when demand peaked. So as a consequence, most early electric companies did not provide daytime service, with 2/3 providing no daytime service in 1897. They just simply shut off power generation. So they had to kind of figure out how to prevent these wide variations in power usage. So the ratio of the average load to the peak load of a central station is called the load factor. For electric companies to increase profitability and lower rates, it was necessary to increase the load factor. The way this was eventually accomplished was through motor load. Motors are used more during daytime and many run continuously. So electric street railways were ideal for load balancing. Many electric railways generated their own power and also sold power and operated distribution systems. The load factor adjusted upward by the turn of the 20th century. At Pearl Street, the load factor increased from 19.3% in 1884 to 29.4% in 1908. By 1929, the load factor around the world was greater than 50%, mainly due to this motor load. So I read a chapter from a book called The Time of the Trolley by William D. Middleton, which was published in 1967 by Kalmbach Publishing. And we focused on the chapter that was really talking about urban electrification and basically the developments in electric street railways that kind of pushed this development of these railways to kind of balance this load factor. So urban electrification built the American city and led to the urbanization of the American populace. In 1831, when the first horse-driven car line ran down New York City's Bowery, only 1 in 12 Americans lived in cities, and New York City had only about 200,000 residents. And then little more than a century later, a full 2 out of 3 Americans lived in cities, with over 100 cities surpassing 100,000 residents. And electric street railways were a big factor in making cities more attractive. There were more options when you lived in a city and a lot more amenities, such as electricity and these street railways. So I wanted to highlight some of the major developments in electric street railway development. And our story really starts all the way back in the battery era. From the very beginning of these batteries, people were trying to figure out how to use this power to make things go, pretty much. So one of the first milestones of the battery era was in 1835. In 1835, Thomas Davenport built and exhibited a model railway run by an electromagnetic motor powered by a crude battery. So he kind of created the concept, he built it in miniature, but it was a few years before somebody could build a full-size working electric railway. In 1838, Robert Davidson of Aberdeen, Scotland, constructed a 7-ton electric locomotive, and he powered his motor by a 40-cell iron zinc sulfuric acid battery. So we kind of talked about these acid batteries last week. They're very noxious, they're very dangerous, they're not ideal for powering motors. And he did make several successful trips with his acid battery powered motor, but ultimately it was wrecked by steam locomotive engineers and firemen who were out to destroy rivals in locomotive technology. I guess there was that kind of fear of being replaced, and so that led to corporate sabotage, basically. Fast forwarding a few years, in 1847, Professor Moses G. Farmer built an experimental electric locomotive that pulled a car that could carry 2 people on an 18-inch wide track. So a very experimental, very small car, could only carry 2 people. And his locomotive was powered by a 48-cell Grove nitric acid battery. And we talked about those Grove batteries last week as well. But again, still not very powerful. It could only carry 2 people. The track was only 18 inches, so obviously very still experimental, not really practically applicable to the real world yet. 1850, a farmer, this time aided by an inventor named Thomas Hall, built and exhibited an electric railway in Boston, and it was the first to be powered by a stationary source rather than on-car power. So the battery wasn't actually on the car, it was stationary and able to power the car remotely, which is pretty impressive. And then in 1851, Professor Charles G. Page designed and built a 16-horsepower battery-powered reciprocating motor that powered a locomotive. And his locomotive was able to reach speeds of 19 miles per hour on a trip between Washington and Bladensburg, Maryland. However, Page's battery the cells were made out of pottery, and they cracked when the train was jolted, and by the end of the trip, the battery was completely destroyed. So obviously the era of the battery just wasn't able to stand up to the demands of this new technology. Something had to be done. So then in the 1860s, the age of the dynamo happened. So this led to an improvement over fragile batteries. And in 1867, again, the inventor Farmer was the first man to successfully operate a dynamo-powered electric locomotive. So that was pretty impressive. Over a decade later, in 1879, Ernst Werner von Siemens with J.G. Halske was the first to successfully operate a generator-powered electric railway in Berlin. His locomotive drew power from an electrified third rail, between the running rails, and he was able to carry 18 passengers at a speed of 8 miles per hour around an oval track that was half a mile long. So still not completely practical, but at least at this point, these inventions were able to actually carry multiple passengers at pretty impressive speeds compared to horse-drawn power. In 1881, Siemens's company opened the first commercial electric railway, consisting of a single car that could carry 26 passengers on a 1.5-mile track. A single motor was mounted under the car body and connected to the axles by wire cables, and this is how the motor powered the car. And the motor drew power from the running rails. This was somewhat dangerous. Having powered running rails, there were some interactions between pedestrians, horses, other street traffic, and you were liable to get a little shock if you accidentally run into these rails. And I'm sure there was some undereducation of people at this time. They probably weren't aware of these electrified rail tracks, which led to these accidents. In 1883, Siemens installed a 6-mile railway in Ireland, and this was notable because it was the first powered by hydroelectric energy. So we talked about last week, hydroelectric turbines were very powerful at this time and able to pretty efficiently and cheaply create energy just using the power of water flow. While this was happening in Europe, there were developments happening in electric traction, electric railways in the US happening concurrently. In 1879, Stephen D. Field developed plans for a railway that drew power from an electrified third rail. And in 1880 and 1881, he constructed and ran an experimental railway in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. At the same time, Edison was experimenting with electric traction in Menlo Park in New Jersey. His design also took power from the running rails. Edison even made plans with Northern Pacific to electrify some of their rail lines, but Northern Pacific's subsequent bankruptcy put the kibosh on those plans. So people were kind of conceiving of plans, but weren't able to apply them to the real world. About half a decade later, in 1885, inventor Leo Daft opened the first commercial electric railway in the U.S. in Baltimore. His designs drew power from an electrified third rail, but after several quote-unquote unfortunate encounters, which sounds like an understatement, between street traffic and his third rail system, he later erected an overhead power system. This early design used a crude pole to draw power from overhead lines. Daft constructed several more electric lines, but none of them as successful as his Baltimore line. He ultimately switched to a 2-wire overhead power collection system after several mishaps with his third rail systems. Daft used 4-wheel carriages called trollers, which is where trolley comes from, and these trollers rode on the wires to collect power, but they had an unfortunate tendency to fall off the wires and crash into the roof of the cars, which really alarmed passengers and kind of damaged their confidence in these electric streetcars. These carriage trollers did eventually get replaced by pole trolleys that collected power in a much safer way. In 1888, the Bentley Knight Company built a line in Allegheny, Pennsylvania that attempted to use an underground conduit system for current collection. They too ultimately had to switch to an overhead wire system. There were just a lot of failures and lack of success that really pushed everybody to switch to this overhead wire system. That was ultimately the most successful way of conveying power to these streetcars. In 1888, Frank J. Sprague created a wheelbarrow motor mounting. So the wheelbarrow concept is the motor was mounted on one side to the axle, and the other part of the motor, the other end of the motor, was able to move somewhat freely, kind of move up and down with the motion of the car. So it was able to maintain contact with the car's axle. The motor's gears were able to be directly connected to the car's axle rather than using chain or belt drives to convey power from the motor to the axles, which is what the major inventors prior to this time were using. Edison, Daft, etc. they were using chain and belt drives to power the axles, which just wasn't as successful as this kind of direct gearing directly onto the car's axle. Sprague operated the Richmond, Virginia railway system, which was the most successful system in the U.S., and he was able to operate 40 cars at one time, which is very impressive. The power load wasn't too much for these electric systems. By the end of 1889, there were no fewer than 154 electric street railway systems in the United States, and by the end of 1890, that number had grown to more than 200, over half of them equipped by Sprague's company. And I just wanted to point out that one thing that me and Bill talked about before the beginning of this recording is I was kind of wondering why these cities would agree to basically be guinea pigs in these experiments in electrification. And we pointed out that these companies were giving a lot of advantages to these cities. They were building these powerhouses. They were electrifying the streets. They were providing electricity to businesses and homes in the area. So there was a really good trade-off to being part of these kind of experiments. So there were a lot of advantages that came with it. So cities were willing to undergo these experiments because the advantages were so great at this time.
Well, and we also did a whole episode with, I believe it was Kelly, who, we were talking about the peak age of horses in cities, and that was just becoming unsustainable. You had just tons and tons and tons of horses crowding the streets. You had horse dung to deal with. If a horse died on the street, that was a problem. We're actually going to do an episode later in the year about a horse pandemic that happened 150 years ago in 1872. So that's something to keep an eye on for, just to give you a little sneak preview. Getting that out of the way by switching to a lot more transportation to electrification, again, another very useful trade-off that American cities were dealing with. The other thing is that the U.S. population was exploding at the time, and you needed somewhere to put all these people, and the existing sort of cityscape and structure didn't seem like it was going to be viable. So continuing our narrative here, at this point we're talking about late 1880s, early 1890s again, the same time as that current war is happening, and then shortly thereafter. This is quoting now, this is based now on the material from the next chapter in the book that Rachel was citing. Between 1890 and 1902, according to the records of the U.S. Department of Commerce and Labor, the total number of U.S. streetcar track miles exploded from 1,262 to almost 22,000. This was the power of streetcar electrification, and with it came a broader grid electrification of most American cities. We've talked on previous episodes about the implications for American cities of the streetcar, especially during and beyond the 1890s after electrification. On our Postal Service episode from August 2020, we talked about the growth of urban mail delivery before the advent of the telephone, with multiple pickups and deliveries per day, especially in business districts, and much of that was facilitated by streetcar, although not exclusively. On our horsepower episode from August 2021, we talked about how streetcars significantly expanded the residential radius of the American city by allowing people to get quickly from home to work from much longer distances without having to walk or ride a horse or horse cab. Both of these points are mentioned in the Middleton book at the start of the chapter by the same title as the book, The Time of the Trolley. Some of the developments associated with streetcars begin, of course, in the horse-drawn era, as Rachel alluded to, but Middleton emphasizes that most of the developments we associate with the streetcar happen extremely rapidly after the beginning of electrification, because that dramatically lengthened the route potential and boosted the speed and volume by passenger weight. They were also much more cost-efficient to run, sometimes 60% less expensive per mile. Streetcars also brought city dwellers out to the growing suburbs, to hundreds of electrified amusement parks owned by the companies, to beach days, and even to funerals in new cemeteries outside the crowding of city limits. Weekend rides even provided a new social activity for young couples in courtship. Parades and sightseeing tours operated over the lines too. All of these served not just as extra trips to support the streetcar company's costs, but also to promote and advertise to potential residents why they should move out to the suburbs permanently, in many cases because the same company that owned the streetcar was developing the real estate there. A $400 million streetcar industry as early as 1890 became a $2 billion industry by 1902. Ridership rose to 5 billion passenger trips, several times greater than steam railroad trips. In 1880, less than 30% of the U.S. population lived in urban areas. By the start of World War I, fully half of the American population would be living in cities. In 1880, there were only 20 U.S. cities that exceeded a population of 100,000. By 1910, there were 50. Some of the tail-end Gilded Age new money fortunes were made in electric streetcar railways. Initially, they were extremely profitable, and even if you invested in one of the loser companies, they would usually be acquired by a nearby competitor for a good windfall anyway. Unfortunately, cities had a tendency to impose fairly extreme financial conditions or inflexible fare caps to grant permission to build new lines, which was fine in the early, most lucrative days of streetcars, but which rendered many lines unprofitable long-term, or sometimes quite quickly. The capitalist mode of operating streetcars with extensive fixed capital assets and intense competitive pressure from redundant service was not well suited to the preserving of a level of service that might otherwise have been delivered, especially as some of the same companies just a few decades later began buying combustion engine buses to get in on the interwar automotive transportation boom. Unsurprisingly, early 20th century left-wing and progressive reformers, particularly in the upper Midwest, often called for municipal socialization of both the streetcar companies and the closely associated, if not co-owned, power and light utility companies to get them out of private for-profit control. Some cities also awarded contracts to streetcar companies to provide various services, for example, to collect garbage or even to put out fires, with specialized equipment in both cases. And as noted earlier, special mail sorting and delivery cars existed just like on regular railroads. Due to federal law, these operated even when local strikes were preventing operation of all other service on a streetcar company. All these kind of special uses tended to be abandoned fastest when motorized trucks arrived on the scene. So that era spanned only about a quarter century as a result. The peak year for the electric streetcar industry overall was 1917, about 3 decades in. By that point, there were over 1,000 companies operating over 60,000 streetcars on 26,000 miles of track, not including electric interurban railroads and the emerging, quote, rapid transit sector. Americans were taking 11 billion trips per year by 1917, generating $600 million in operating revenues. And again, just in case this wasn't clear, one other point that I feel I really need to underscore here is that in many cases, this power stuff for American cities was being generated by the electric streetcar companies. They were one and the same company. This is how you get urban electrification, is by building the power infrastructure to run electric streetcars, which is efficient and creates a bunch of new demand for electricity and then justifies all the other electrification for the rest of the cities. Rachel, did you have any other thoughts or observations on this?
I do wish that we had listened to those progressive reformers in the early 20th century and did go towards municipal socialization of streetcar companies and power companies, if whether or not they were one and the same. It's so sad to imagine a world that could have looked so different with these socially owned streetcars that could still be in operation today. Now trolleys are kind of like a novelty touristy thing, but you can see that they're still efficiently moving people from point A to point B in a nice, pretty inexpensive manner. And it's sad to see that they got phased out over the years in favor of these privately owned automobiles that we've all been kind of pushed into to the great loss of these cities.
And of course, the compromise technology that eventually gets invented but never quite comes to dominance in the way that it should was the trolley bus, or as we would call it around Massachusetts, the trackless trolley. There's still a lot in Dayton, Ohio, but like they just took out a few weeks ago here, as I'm recording this in the spring of 2022, they just took out the trackless trolley service that was still running in the Boston area. And, my dad and I went out and rode that shortly before it closed. There's still a little bit of a thing that can go back and forth between diesel on the surface and overhead wire power underground. But those trackless trolleys, as that version of the name suggests, solves the problem of getting jammed up in traffic and not being able to move around an obstacle that streetcars faced, while still drawing overhead power much more efficiently than battery buses, and certainly much more environmentally friendly than non-electric power buses. And of course, we're not talking about the later era with things like light rail rapid transit on dedicated lines. We're not getting into right now about the underground subway technology, which in many cases, as you I'm sure all know, involves third rail, which is a technology that Rachel talked about earlier. Not something that worked so well on surface running, but was still a viable technology for underground. But this transition happens very, very, very quickly, and I cannot emphasize that enough. It's basically almost entirely over the course of the 1890s, a single decade alone, give or take a few years on either side, to go from let's experiment around a little bit with electric streetcars to full electrification of streetcars in almost every American city, if not every American city, by the end of this little period of time, and significantly increasing the capacity, the mileage, the ridership, and everything. It happened almost overnight in American cities and makes American cities what they are today. There's obviously a lot of other technologies that come in later that also contribute, but you don't get American cities, especially the American sprawl, without the electric streetcars, almost as much as the impact of automobiles had. But again, automobiles were just sort of compounding and extending a trend that was already starting by around 1890. The other thing that I want to mention before we wrap up this week is that there was some non-urban electrification that starts happening not long after this period, and Rachel actually alluded briefly to it with one of Edison's potential projects that was not realized in this initial period, which is long-distance rail electrification. So a lot of the technologies that she was talking about earlier were for railroad electrification experiments and ended up being applied to urban streetcars. But as we talked about in great depth, citing the same author, Middleton, Justin Rosniak and I talked about it on a special episode in February of 2021, where we talked about U.S. long-distance rail electrification, which again is also a separate category from interurban electrification. That was starting to happen, stringing up wires all over the country to provide long distance by basically the first decade of the 20th century. So a little bit later than the period we're talking about now, but not all that much longer after. And that doesn't get into real depth of rural electrification because it's we'll talk about that on that dedicated episode coming up. But there's a cost problem associated with trying to do rural electrification because of the low density of people and businesses compared to American cities. And so you have to solve those distance problems. But the railroads, especially those Mountain West railroads that had, to worry about not only the distribution of fueling resources, but also their ability to start and stop trains safely. It's the same problem that we talked about with the Westinghouse air brakes, why that was adopted so quickly in the Mountain West. Electric power for those heavy trains had a major advantage in stopping and starting in the mountains. And so we do start to see that spreading out, and that's kind of the next big phase of electrification in the United States after the urban electrification of the 1890s. You then start moving into, about 10 years later, the long-distance electrification between cities, but still not providing that depth of rural electrification that we finally start getting into toward the end of the 1920s and into the early 1930s, things like the Tennessee Valley Authority and other associated projects. Rachel, did you have any final thoughts on this story of urban electrification in the United States and the role that the electric streetcar played in that?
No, I think we covered the big highlights. It's just interesting that it was such a short-lived era, but it did make such a huge impact in the urbanization of America.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on this week to talk about this. And as always, the notes will be up at arsenalfordemocracy.com with the episode.
Thanks for having me.